It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the organisers and Bev and Natsumi and everybody for making me feel so welcome. What I'd like to do is to kind of exemplify, give you a potted history of time and some of the things that I've been involved in that I would use as examples of good and not so good examples of knowledge exchange. I come from a academic interface. I've spent the last 25 years, for goodness sake, in the academic industry interface, having come from a corporate that used to be Amersham Pharmacia and is now part of the GE conglomerate. So I want to tell you a little bit about how it all started and get you right up to speed with some of the things that I'm involved in today. But as Bev has quite rightly said, there are three components that anyone involved in knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, incubation, ecosystem, cluster, community development. You need people, you need infrastructure, and you need money. And without one component of those, you're really going to frustrate and disappoint quite a lot of people. So that's the kind of take-home message from me today. I wanted to start by sharing with you the disparate nature of the activities that are involved in purporting to be knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, community and cluster development. And of course they start with university technology transfer. There are the knowledge transfer networks, of course, you can read them. But there are others that are not so familiar with people that include things like the NC3Rs, non-animal testing. That's another community around academic industrial engagement. There are a growing number of accelerator programs coming up throughout the UK, and I've been involved in one at Harwell, and one of my companies has been involved at the Cambridge and Imperial White City accelerator programs. There's a really good innovation optimizer program that is at the entrepreneur academic stage that helps to get them shaped and ready for business engagement or spinning out their own companies. And of course, we're all pointing at the Industry Challenge Fund. So where I started was at the University of Manchester, and this is Lord Sainsbury DTI days, where first European campus-based incubator was built at the University of Manchester. And this is the model that we developed that hasn't really changed over the period of time. Accelerators, grow-ons, cluster development, all started with this: let's get academics involved early, let's get them in front of mentors and industry to give them a perspective. And I always talk about, and I've seen it too frequently, where you sit an academic in front of an industry person and they say, why are you doing this? We did this 10 years ago. And that still happens too often. And that, to me, should form the necessity for early academic industrial engagement. And what we developed that then others built into accelerator programs was the need for grow-on. The incubator manager's dilemma was that early stage companies, and we had Renovo and Intercytex and F2G and Motac and DXS, who on the back of investment were growing and growing and growing. And an incubator only has a limited amount of space. So what do you do? And if you kick one of them out, your profit line just goes down. And if you're an university stakeholder-based incubator, that's not a good thing. So the incubator dilemma is based on, if you're too successful too early, what do you do with those companies that grow quickly? And I think some of the work that Uday Phadke's doing at the moment around grow on and scale up and unicorns is saying, how do we make better use and how do we improve the process for companies? We do incubation very well. Fortunately, 10, 15, 20 years later, we've actually learnt how to do this properly, and there are now scalable and actually profitable or generating a surplus type companies. So it's at the next stage of accelerator. It's a very old slide. We used to talk about family, fools and friends investing at the early stage, and we used to talk about public offerings. And we don't talk about that as much these days, but hopefully soon, one day, that IPO window will open up again. But this is the kind of knowledge exchange leading to the various stages of business development, business growth, where you're taking idea to clinic. And although this is a funding slide, I think the reason that we're all in the life science space is for patient benefit. And I don't think any of us lose sight of that. So around 2000, I used to talk about the importance of having alumni networks, having wins, early wins, showing we're not very good in this country around shouting from the rooftops, and very often clusters that I see in Europe and the US who actually provide less of an offering or a value proposition than we do are better at shouting from the rooftops. So for me, the UK has to get better at shouting at some of the success stories that we undoubtedly have. We don't do everything well. We still don't network well enough, in my opinion, and certainly the next generation could do it better, but that's just a personal opinion. But here's the thing. We are so disconnected in the UK, and Dave Hardman, good friend of mine, came from the Birmingham and is now Birmingham Science Park CEO, part of the MSP Bruntwood conglomerate. He used to say, we're all in little ponds and little islands across the UK, and we don't connect up well enough. And this was pointed at the incubators and the science parks. Government were getting the message that we were all competing. And actually, incubators only incubate within a 30-mile radius. So how on earth would we compete in Manchester with Cambridge or London? It does not happen. And so the messaging of what we do and why we do has to get better. But more importantly, we need to connect our clusters better. And you'll see why it's becoming increasingly important as cluster development across sectors. Convergence is not just coming now with IT, engineering, and other components having an impact on new drugs and new therapies, and the digital age is here. So, welcome to Open Innovation. I was about 2 years behind, maybe 3, the structural genomics, and Chaz was a mentor for me on how to do open innovation well. And for me, we were one of 5 or 6 experiments that GSK has set up globally around validating whether our open innovation might work or not. So very much an experimental, let's see what we can do. The hypothesis was, rather than build an incubator accelerator next to a university, would it make any difference to UK biotech if we built it next to one of the biggest pharma in the world? That was the hypothesis that we were testing. And we had important stakeholders in Wellcome and GSK who are not as interested in the bottom line and were more interested in reputational credibility, improve the process, and get people talking earlier in that academic industry engagement. And the bottom line for me, and it always has been, don't take my word for it. Always get a good academic group to come and validate what you've been doing. So we very early on engaged with the University of Lancaster Business School, who came in and did their own analysis of what open innovation actually did. And they actually developed, and nobody else had them at this stage for incubation and open innovation, important KPIs for how we could measure the open innovation element alongside the incubation accelerator element. And they have published all of this. And their conclusions were about this combination of having tight controls and loose controls around vision, around IP, around quality, around spaces. But the looser controls are around the people bit and the networking and the business models that you use and partnerships. And I've always said open innovation is never a panacea. It's one element, one business model, one component. And I used to talk a lot at Stevenage around, if your first question to me about open innovation was what's the IP position, then you don't have that open approach to being receptive to making open innovation happen. That's quite controversial. I don't think that's disproven yet, but it's just my view. The appetite to engage, and then Bev will remember all the conversations around the bumper car model. You have to create an environment around where people bump into each other enough times over coffee, beer and pizza, science seminars, all of that, where they finally turn around and say, what do you do? And it used to frustrate me a lot that even in incubators you can create silos where people don't talk to each other. So the whole vision behind Stevenage was to create coffee areas and nodes and open areas to make sure that people went and talked to each other about what they did. And it worked. It didn't work for everyone, But it was a nice model, and there's lots of success at Stevenage around over 60 companies, over £600 million of investment, and now patient benefit coming through with some of the cell and gene therapies and some of the drugs. And my colleague in the front row might tell you about one of those successes. So it's all good. It's a good starting point for UK spine, but it won't be the panacea. Again, there's lots of good models out there that UK Spine should be tapping into. This is a complementary one that I'm on the advisory panel for, called Devices for Dignity. It's a national resource. Don't forget what I said about ponds and little islands and connecting up all this. And although their focus is on medical devices per se, they are so complementary to what the UK Spine do. And one of their strengths is translation. I've seen it firsthand. And I'm very supportive of this activity. And Pippa's in the audience, so you might want to go and talk to her about what great things they're doing and what they're planning around industry engagement. Okay, so it's like back to the future for me. Having proved the hypothesis that incubation next to a big pharma works, now it's go and work as chairman of a science park that already has one of the biggest pharma on the in the world, and is open and receptive and has all the infrastructure and all the people to make this happen. And the track record from Viagra to other drugs that have come out of that Sandwich site is incredible. So there's a lot of potential to create that alumni network that I was talking about around that bumper car model. But what we're looking for initially, because there's so much lab space, is our bigger anchor tenants. And our flavour, and why we won't compete with Alderley and Harwell and Babraham, is because we're much more at the clinical development manufacturing space. I was telling Chaz that Pfizer still do 60-70% of their manufacturing of their small molecules at that Sandwich site. And the good news for me is that Pfizer are coming out to play a bit more. They've public domain announcements around investing in the site, public domain announcements around creating jobs at the site, and telling me that they would like to work with us on they don't call it open innovation, they call it pre-competitive collaborations. Who knew? So it's a really exciting, and you start to tap into some of the experiences that you've had from that Manchester incubator days to Stevenage, all the way back to Amish and Pharmacia days as science director, where we were doing open innovation without actually realising it. You create shared labs, you create startup zones, you make sure that you've got a really good events and conferencing facility. And yes, the beer and pizzas and the coffee does play an important part in that bumper car model. So our aspirations are around manufacturing village, building a life science cluster, rebuilding or growing what we already have, strong science base, pre-competitive partnerships, and really, access to funding. We've got local Kent life science funds, but we want all the Schroders and the Abingworths to know what's going on at the park, and that anchor tenancy. And if I get my way, of course, there will be an incubator at Discovery Park, but not in the first phase. But we're working with people like Andy to come up with our own flavour of hub, boot camp, incubator, grow on, accelerator. And Andy's in the audience today. All right, UK Spine is very much focused on the industrial strategy, and I think we all should be. And these are just some of the pillars that I use to really shape what we're trying to do at Discovery Park, what we've done in the past at Stevenage. And again, you can see it's got that whole people, infrastructure and money elements, but it's about driving growth across the whole country. You hear the government talk much more about productivity these days than they do about incubation and the early stage. And I think that's partly an acknowledgement that we do the incubation space bit reasonably well, but we don't yet have that grow on, scale up, unicorn type activity that Uday talks about, and whether unicorns exist, of course. That's another debate. So all this is being driven by changes in technology, and I've never known such a period in my life where technology is changing so quickly. I have graphene on my doorstep in Manchester, and everyone's, what should we do with it in life science? Should we coat plates? There's Nobel Prize winning science that just is not getting translated in the life sciences as well as it could do. Slightly controversial, but we need to do better in that translation bit, and that should hopefully lead to developing, growing, scalable companies. I just wanted to remind you of what the answer was when I started. It's all about money. It's all about providing the infrastructure. It's about people. It's about creating those ecosystems with people who can, you know, I'm a great believer in the no hair and the grey hairs, having an impact on the next generation, the young entrepreneurs, making sure that that engagement happens early enough so that people aren't developing things that were already developed 10 years ago. And that still, unfortunately, is happening too frequently. So, for me, I mean, I was privy to talking to the former CEO at MIT who developed their ecosystem, and she talked about building innovation capacity. And that is a driver for me. That is a real learning point about how they were working in silos, and it was only until they connected things up and had the level of public and private partnership that is necessary to make it happen. A personal driver is we've got this wonderful farmer parks across the UK who are completely disconnected. And we need to connect them up because, you know, it's not about the practitioners, it's about the companies who are based in Alderley who might tap into the manufacturing capability in Stevenage or Discovery Park and connecting the people across those parks. Oy vey. And then the other thing is the next generation. We need more STEM students, we need them more enthused and excited, and guess what? Science parks are a hotbed for a whole cross-section of jobs that are not just for PhDs and undergrads. So I talk about schools to science parks. Unfortunately for me, I walked into Discovery Park and they do more than any other science park in the UK around community schools engagement. And we have a community lab already set up with Pfizer and Canterbury Christchurch, targeting the next generation. We need to connect up our clusters. We need to be aware that IT, electronics and engineering is impacting. Bioelectronics, hopefully, is the next generation, the next future for new therapies and new treatments. More market pull, not technology pull. I think that's still a debate across the UK. More funding at early stage. Of course, I would say that. But I think we need to do better with what we do with that money at the early stage. And local governments want to play a role in developing life science strategies for their regions, and they all have it as an imperative. And I don't think we, as knowledge exchange people, transfer our knowledge into that business engagement space well enough yet. And the little vision on the right there is an event that we ran in Manchester 2 weeks ago, showcasing what's going on in bioelectronics and engineering and vision sciences to an industry group. And that worked tremendously, and we need to do more of that across the UK. Okay, Bev, we got there. So I think this is kind of a prequel to the panel discussion. I'm sure you can read them. I do believe the people piece is more important than whether the IP piece gets in the way, because I think the IP piece is resolvable. And I saw it resolved at Stevenage. It never once got in the way of a commercial opportunity happening. Not once. So if the first question is what about the IP, then open innovation is not for you, quite frankly. I think the IP position could be improved. I think that's for debate. I don't think it's the bottom line, and I don't think it should be the focus. Connection and collaboration across the UK, yes please, more of it, across our clusters, across our science parks, incubators and universities with industry engagement. Don't forget though, what about the SMEs? This is not just about corporates. I don't want frictionless KE to exist, quite frankly. My boss at Amersham used to say, if there isn't blood on the walls between R&D and marketing, then you're not doing it properly. So it requires a little bit of tension. I'm not advocating blood on the walls, but believe me, I'm a pacifist, honestly. But a little bit of tension goes a long way, quite frankly. It really does. And what the UK does best, of course, is the research base. And I think we are improving on the translation. Remember what I said about, identifying our wins and really shouting from the rooftops a little bit more. It doesn't come naturally to us, but we need to do it. Okay, I think that is my presentation. Thank you for listening.